Before listening to this sermon, if you please read Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13. The title of this sermon is Knowing Your Enemy. Knowing Your Enemy. Now, James Bond, he might be a fictional character, but every government has its own set of spies. Such spies are essential to discover details about the enemy. For in every war, knowing your enemy is a must. Who is the enemy? Where are they based? What are their tactics? When and how do they plan to attack? We need to know how to answer these questions if we to know best how to face our enemy. And it's for these reasons that God has given us Revelations chapter 12 and chapter 13. The knowledge and the wisdom that we gain in these chapters are essential to surviving the Christian life. A lack of an awareness of an enemy and his tactics has led many a Christian to give up their Christian faith altogether. Next time you go to church, ask who was a part of the church 10 years ago. Then ask if they're still following Jesus now. Ask these questions and you'll hear about thousands of Christian corpses that now lie dead on the battlefield. Christians who've been led astray or given up their faith, all because they failed to spot the tactics of the enemy. Tactics that are described in Revelation chapter 13. Chapter 13 of Revelation, it's not there to help filmmakers make films or to give theologians stuff to debate about. Chapter 13 is there because it's the Christian's sword and shield. Failure to understand and apply what chapter 13 teaches, and you'll almost definitely end up a Christian corpse. But if you understand and apply chapter 13, your faith will survive. So knowing your enemy. It involves knowledge, application, and wisdom. So first of all, knowledge. So just answer quickly, briefly, a few questions. Question 1, who is the Christian's enemy? Well, in chapter 12, we're introduced to the Christian's enemy. Satan is symbolically described as a red dragon. And in chapter 13, the tactics of Satan are described in a symbolic way. The beast that rises out of the sea is a symbolic way of describing the way Satan works in the world. Next question, where does the beast come from? Well, verse 1 describes the beast as coming out of the sea. The beast is clearly a foreigner, an intruder in God's good creation, who seeks to wage war with the native people on the land. What is the beast like? The beast has features that resemble a leopard, a bear, and a lion. And this is a very strange picture to us, but it's a very familiar picture to John's first readers. John, who received this vision from God, recorded it for Christians in the first century. And these Christians would have been very familiar with the Old Testament letter of Daniel, in which 3 great empires were described in a symbolic way. The Babylonian Empire was described as like a lion. The Persian Empire was described as like a bear. The Greek Empire was described as like a leopard. These 3 great empires were described using the images of 3 great beasts. And since the beast in Revelation chapter 13 combines the features of all of these beasts, the beast in Revelation 13 is seen to be truly great indeed. Great in quantity, reigning longer than all these other empires combined. Great in quality, extremely powerful and mighty. In verse 5 we read, so next question 4, when is the beast allowed to reign? Well, in verse 5 we read that the beast is allowed to exercise its authority for 42 months. a period of 3.5 years, or 101,260 days. You need to remember that Revelation is a symbolic book, so the period of 42 months, it's not to be taken literally. Instead, 42 months, or 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, it's used throughout Revelation to describe the time period in which God's people are persecuted. This being something that has occurred since Jesus' ascension and will continue until Jesus comes again. There's a little note underneath the video if you want to understand a bit more about why Revelation uses 42 months or to describe the period between Jesus' first and second coming. So the beast basically is allowed to persecute and attempt to deceive God's people throughout the period between Jesus' first and second coming. That's why John himself describes himself in chapter 1 as sharing in the tribulation of God's people. Tribulations which chapter 7 records as continuing until Jesus comes again. So, in summary, who is the enemy? Satan and his beast-like agent. Where does the beast come from? He is a foreigner who rises out of the sea. What is this beast like? He's great in quality, extremely powerful and mighty, and great in quantity, reigning for a long period till someone greater in authority defeats him. When is this beast allowed to reign? From the time of Jesus' ascension until the time when Jesus comes again. In other words, this beast is exercising his influence in our world today. Now I realise that you probably didn't see a beast roaming around in your back garden last time you looked outside the window. You might have seen a cat or a pigeon, but not a beast. And did you know that there are 10 million domestic cats in the UK? And with an average poo rate of 1 poo every day, every British garden stands the potential of being bombed. Now that's a fact, a very interesting fact, but it's not a fact that's going to cause you to get on your feet and out of your chair. And yet the moment you see one cat pooing in your back garden, I can guarantee that you'll be jumping out of your seat and shouting unchristian things and waving your fist. You know, words and facts inform our minds. But whereas words and facts help us know things, pictures and images help us feel things. Hatred of cats pooing on our garden is one of the things that a picture can cause us to hate. Chapter 12 tells us something. We have an enemy. However, God just doesn't want us to tell us this important information. God wants us to feel the importance of this information as well. And that's why throughout Revelation, pictures and symbols are used to help us to feel the importance of what we read. The picture we get of the beast rising out of the sea teaches us that Satan is an intruder seeking to invade and attack the natives on land. An intruder that is an invader seeking to wreak havoc in our lives. You know, one cat poo in your garden is the least you have to worry about. For every one thing you do to keep cats out of your back garden, you need to be doing 1,000 things to resist temptation and strengthen your faith. The picture that we get of a beast rising out of the sea teaches us that the Satan is a foreigner to God's good creation. It reminds us that this world is still God's creation, in which God has ultimate authority. That's why we read of the beast being given a degree of authority and being given permission to exert his power. The greatest force in this world is not Satan, but God. If you ever feel a victim, too weak to resist Satan's temptations, well, God can strengthen you. If you ever feel that God's people will always remain the victim, remember that God can and will act to redeem and vindicate his people once and for all. The picture we get of a great beast helps us to feel the force and importance of what is being taught us. The unseen forces at work in this world are not to be underestimated, just because they cannot be seen. You know, Satan has an agenda when he turns up the volumes of your temptations. Satan has an agenda when he tries to use persecution to get Christians to give up and give in. Satan has an agenda when he leads people towards idolatry. Satan's agenda is always to ruin and destroy. The picture of the beast reigning for 42 months is both terrifying and reassuring. It's terrifying because, can you imagine being stuck in a lift with this beast for 42 months? Can you imagine having to fight temptation all of your life, always being on guard? Can you imagine always being in the minority, always standing the potential of being rejected because of your Christian faith? The entire Christian life is a constant battle that goes on uninterrupted for a symbolic 42 months till Jesus comes again. None of us can afford to go to sleep. The picture that we get of the beast reigning for 42 months is both terrifying and reassuring. If the time of the beast's reign is 42 months, then the beast's time of authority has an end to it. If you are a Christian, you are called to persevere in faith, resist temptation, endure suffering to the bitter end, till the 43rd month, so to speak, till the time when Jesus comes again. So that was knowledge, and now application. You know, despite verses 1 to 5 being difficult to understand, verses 6 to 10 are not. Reading verse 6. The beast opens its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. It's clear in verses 6 and 7 that the beast opposes God and it opposes God's people, that is, Christian believers. The weapon the beast uses to oppose God's people include, firstly, the power of hate, persecution, unbelievers who reject or attack Christians. Secondly, the power of love, for example, temptation, seeking to lead us astray through sinful desires. Thirdly, the power of lies, false teaching, false philosophies that are prevalent in the world. How are our believers to respond to these attacks? To the power we to respond to the power of hate, the power of love, the power of lies. We read in verse 10. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Normally, war is an agent of change. During the two world wars, technology and weaponry developed faster than ever. During the coronavirus pandemic, scientists have worked harder than ever to develop a vaccine. During personal difficulties, we invest time, money, and effort trying to change our circumstances. And yet, God's message to believers in their war is not to change at all. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. You know, being a Christian can feel like being in captivity, being a stranger who thinks and lives differently to everybody else, Because this makes being a Christian hard, our tactic is to change in order to fit in. Perhaps changing by lowering our standards. Perhaps changing by changing what we believe in order to fit in. Perhaps changing our priorities so that we seek the same worldly idols as everyone else. Our tactic to such difficulties is to change. However, God calls us to stay the same. To keep believing God's word, to keep living according to God's moral standards, to keep prioritizing the things of God. If anyone is to go into captivity, don't change in order to avoid it. Into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword, don't change to avoid it. With the sword they will be killed. You know, Jesus had to patiently endure to the point where he was killed. That's why Jesus in the book of Revelation is often referred to as the Lamb who was slain. Throughout the book of Revelation, Christians who have been slain for their faith are frequently referred to. That's why the more literal translation of verse 10 reads like this: If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. When it uses that word slain, it's saying that believers can expect to suffer the same type of persecution as Jesus. That won't always be physical martyrdom, but it'll be same in the saying that we suffer the same rejection, the same mockery, and in some circumstances the same physical violence. Believers can expect to suffer the same types of persecution as Jesus, and in such persecutions we are to patiently endure. Our tactic normally to such persecution is to change, changing from speaking to staying quiet, changing from being a victim to being the one who fights back, changing from the hard path to the easy path of compromise or giving up. Our tactic to difficulties is to change, but God calls us to stay the same. Verse 10, this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Knowledge, we need to know our enemy and his tactic. Application, we need to stay faithful to God and persevere. We need knowledge, but not only do we need knowledge, we need wisdom as well. We need to recognize the roots by which such attacks come. So, thirdly and lastly, wisdom. In verses 11 to 17, a second beast appears. These verses describe, using picture language, the tactics of Satan in more detail. These tactics include, firstly, lies. The second beast deceives people through appearing to be a lamb, a picture of innocence as well as an assertion to be greater than God's own Son. However, this beast is clearly an agent of Satan, appearing like a lamb but speaking like a dragon. Tactic number 2, love. Using the power of lies, the second beast seeks to draw people away from the love of God. It seeks to get people to honour the first beast and worship the idol-like image. The love and honour of God being replaced by the love and honour of other things. Third tactic, hate. Those who love and honour the beast gain an advantage. They are marked by the number 666, which allows them to buy and sell stuff in the marketplace. Whereas God's people who refuse to worship this first beast are not given this mark and are disadvantaged as a result. They cannot buy and sell in the marketplace, and so they suffer as a result. This is a symbolic way of describing the disadvantages Christians will experience in an unbelieving world. So what does all this mean, and how do we apply it? Well, verse 18 reads like this. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Within the number 666 is some clue to the identity of this beast-like figure. Someone who inserts himself to be God, but isn't. Someone who deceives people into idolatry. Someone who persecutes God's people by causing them to be disadvantaged in society. Now, people throughout the ages have played number games in order to try and identify who this beast-like figure might represent. Often they call this person the Antichrist, who is both Antichrist and Christ's people. To give you some of the history of how people have tried to identify this beast, well, in the 1st century, some claimed that the Roman Emperor Nero was the Antichrist, for Nero demanded worship and he significantly opposed God's people. During the time of the Reformation, some people believed that the Catholic Pope was the Antichrist, for through false teaching, the Pope deceived people and caused people to worship Mary. In the 20th century, people thought Hitler could have been the Antichrist, demanding total honour and persecuting both Christians and Jews. People throughout the ages have played number games in order to try and identify who this beast-like figure might represent, using a system by which letters represent numbers in order to calculate the beast's name through some kind of code-cracking endeavour. Who is right? Are they all right? How are we to apply these verses to our lives? Well, what is needed to understand and apply these verses is wisdom, not mathematical genius. And wisdom has to do with good judgment. And good judgment involves being able to distinguish between what is true and what is false. Now, we all exercise this judgment at the supermarket every week. We need judgment to distinguish Heinz soup from Hans tomato soup, a less worthy imitation. We need good judgment to distinguish Penguin chocolate biscuits from Puffin chocolate biscuits. Now, Puffin bars are trying to rob McVitie's Penguin bars of business by pretending to be them. We need judgment to distinguish Weetabix from wheat biscuits. They look the same, they smell the same, but they do not taste the same. Now, good judgment at the supermarket involves being able to distinguish between what is true and what is false. Good judgment in the Christian life involves being able to distinguish what is God and what is not. 666 is all about a claim to deity. That is a claim to be God in some way. 7 being the perfect number which the false trinity of 666 seeks to imitate but falls short. The beast with the number 666 claims to be God, attempts to reach deity, but it is described as very clearly as a man. That's not a description of the beast's gender. It's a description that it claims to be God, but it's actually a man. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. So, when I say man, I should say it claims to be deity. It makes a claim to be God, but it isn't, is what it's kind of saying. So, what in your society claims to be God, but isn't? What are people drawn to worship, idolize, and honor? What claims absolute authority and demands absolute obedience? What claims to speak what is true, but actually speaks what is false? These are the false gods that exist in our society. Nero, the Roman Emperor, claimed to be God, but wasn't. During the Reformation, the Pope drew people towards the idolatry of Mary. During World War II, Hitler claimed absolute authority and demanded absolute obedience. In our day, the Maybelline advert claims to speak what is true, but actually speaks what is false, causing us to idolize ourselves because you are worth it. That's the Maybelline slogan, in case you don't know. Now, all of these people who have been identified as the Antichrist, the Pope, Hitler, Nero, the people who are identifying such things as the Antichrist were both wrong and right. They were wrong if they were looking for one final Antichrist that would appear at the end of the world. But they were all right in that they wisely identified the beast's manifestation in their own day. They recognized that which claims to be God, but isn't. They spotted the things that people are drawn to worship, idolize, and honor. They identified people and governments that claim absolute authority and demand absolute obedience. They were on the lookout for philosophies and beliefs that claim to speak truth, but actually speak lies. You know, every supermarket has its own version of foodstuff that claim to be something that they are not. There is a Hans claiming to be a Heinz in every supermarket. And in the same way, in every society, in every generation, in every culture, there will be things, people, organizations that claim to be worthy of worship or claim to speak what is true. But actually, they speak lies and certainly do not deserve to be worshipped. Our job, the wisdom we need, is to spot these things in our culture, in our society, in our day. So, for example, in China, the manifestation of the beast might be the communist government, a government that claims absolute authority and demands absolute obedience. But then again, could not the same be said of Western materialism? A material lifestyle that demands we work hard and play hard as we obey every advert that we see on the TV. In many ways, Western materialism is a lie, promising us to be happiness. And it draws us away from God through temptation, because we idolize the things that we own. You and I need the wisdom to recognize in our society what claims to be God but isn't. The things that we're drawn to worship and idolize and honor. We need to spot what makes absolute demands on our time, money, and attention. We need to recognize lies that are taught and believed by many, but are contrary to all that God says is true. These things are the beast's manifestation in our society, in our culture. What we need is the wisdom to recognize it. So, in summary, knowledge, we need to know our enemy and his tactics. Application, we need to stay faithful to God and persevere, and not no matter what temptation or lies or persecutions are thrown in our direction. Wisdom, we need to recognize the idols, lies, and temptations in our society. And in contrast to the rest of the world, we need to worship, love, and obey God alone.